What's the Trump view of the Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump iteration of the Monroe Doctrine? What does that look like?
Well, as usual with this administration, we've had very conflicting accounts on precisely what that is. You had Rubio essentially saying other countries, adversaries of the U.S. need to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. He said they are not going to allow a situation where Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest in the world, would be controlled by adversaries such as Russia or China. And then President Trump, when asked about that, basically said, sure, Western Hemisphere and all that, but this is really about an individual country. And everything we hear at this point is essentially in the president's thinking, it was based on a real direct animus he had with Nicolás Maduro. I mean, what you've seen now essentially is them allowing the Vice President Delcy Rodríguez to become the acting president. And, she comes essentially from the same group, the Chavistas that Maduro belonged to. So we may see a change in policy from Venezuela under U.S. pressure, but we're not really seeing a major rotation in the group of people who were ruling the country, aside from Maduro himself.
Right. Big changes need to happen for there to be a different direction for Venezuela going forward. Having said that, Nick, I wanted to ask you, how important is Venezuela to U.S. national security?
It's a great question, Carol, because there are a lot of conflicting accounts on that. I mean, if you ask an international law expert, they would say there is no direct threat to the United States from Venezuela. You would essentially need Venezuela to basically be attacking the United States to put forward an argument for self-defense. But, this administration has taken a much more expansive view of U.S. authorities, saying that the drug running that they allege was passing through Venezuela was killing thousands and thousands of Americans. And then they also say, the oil issue and the influence of U.S. adversaries. So they have argued that Venezuela was cultivating ties with Hezbollah and Iran and China and Russia, and they're not going to allow those adversaries to gain a toehold in the Western Hemisphere. And so therefore there was a direct threat to U.S. national security. And, that's really the sort of the foundation on which a lot of the U.S. legal arguments rest in this case for the sort of stepped up aggression against Venezuela. So they're really leaning into that. But, in terms of a direct existential threat to Americans based on what we would conventionally think of as what constitutes the use of force in self-defense, the legal experts argue that it's just not really there.
What about when it comes to what's actually happening on the ground and the experience of Venezuelans, and to what extent the administration actually has that in mind? I was struck that we didn't hear much of that during the press conference. In the past, when the U.S. has played a role in ousting leaders, it's talked about the role of democracy and humanitarian challenges in countries and used that as a way to talk about why regime change was important. And now we're getting reporting that from our Bloomberg News team, Venezuela regroups with new president, old repression tactics. The government has detained on Monday morning and early afternoon at least 7 journalists and members of the press. What's the relationship there?
Well, no, certainly. I mean, we have not seen the administration put forward the idea of human rights or concerns over democracy as a major reason for this. And, that's evidenced by the fact that aside from Maduro, as I mentioned, they've basically left the rest of the regime in place. And by all accounts, at least from our reporting, it looks like the regime is essentially cracking down on any notion of dissent. So we don't really get a sense that that's driving things. On the other hand, the administration has also said, Maduro was an illegitimate president, and they cite the election whereby it's widely believed that he got returned to the presidency via illegitimate means. But then that's contradicted on the other side by the fact that President Donald Trump has essentially said, Maria Corina Machado is they don't believe that she's strong enough to essentially be the president, even though it was her group, her proxy, who international observers believed essentially won that election. So it's a lot of conflicting talk from the administration, and the president and his administration really putting the emphasis on the oil and this drug running idea, and the idea that this was strictly a law enforcement operation against Nicolás Maduro himself.
The other thing, Nick, that we've been thinking about, why Venezuela, but also And Eric Schatzker brought this up. Like, why is this happening now? When I think about the last couple of weeks and how much time we've spent talking about the Middle East again and Israel and Gaza, certainly Ukraine and Russia. I'm just curious, why this is happening now.
Again, a question that we have been trying to answer for a long time. We do know that the Trump administration had sought to pressure Nicolás Maduro to leave power in the first term. So there was a maximum pressure campaign and a push to recognize then opposition leader Juan Guaido, and administration, the officials at the time were saying, Maduro's on his way out. It could be weeks, certainly no more than months. We then had a lull during the Biden administration, and this sort of came back to the fore under the second Trump administration, where you have elements of the administration like Marco Rubio, who draws a direct line between Venezuela and Cuba, where he wants to see that regime ushered from power. But then a lot of the reporting we've also seen in the last several days suggests that there had been a long conversation between the U.S. and elements within Venezuela to push for a negotiated exit for Maduro, based in part and sort of pushed in part by some of these views within the administration. And Trump, for one reason or another, basically ran out of patience and felt an even stronger degree of animus toward Maduro himself, and so just decided to go ahead with it. And it was really nothing, not any sort of broader strategic resonance beyond that.